Raise your hand if you've ever introduced yourself as a perfectionist, or if you've ever put it on a resume, or here's one, said it in a job interview when asked what your biggest weakness is, or just worn it as a badge of honor because it meant you cared more than other people. Here's the problem. Perfectionism is not a high standard. It is not ambition. It is not even really about quality. The research is very clear on what perfectionism actually is, and it's not a strength. Perfectionism nearly crushed my life when I was 14 years old, and I'm going to tell that story later in the episode.
Yeah, perfectionism is a fear response. It's the brain protecting you from judgment, failure, and shame by holding you to a standard so high that you're never exposed to any of those things. Because if you never fully try, you can never fully fail. And if it is not done yet, it cannot be criticized yet. So today we're getting into what perfectionism actually is, where it comes from, why it is rising across generations, and most importantly, what to actually do about it. Because the answer is not lowering your standards. It is understanding what your standards are actually protecting you from.
Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with NUE, that's NUE, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world. What really stood out to me, Luke, as we prepared for this was just the realization and reading the research that perfectionism is not the same as high standards. It's often confused as high standards. But this is the most important distinction in the entire episode, is really that those are not the same thing.
Yeah, high standards is, I want to do this well, and I can adjust if I fall short or when I fall short. And then perfectionism is more, if this is not perfect, it means I am not enough and I cannot survive other people seeing that.
Yeah, one is about work and the other is about identity. And perfectionism is not a personality trait. It's a learned pattern of self-protection. It's really rooted in specific fear, like you mentioned. It's the fear of being seen as inadequate. And it's so common, it feels normal, but it's not. And it's getting more common every generation, which we'll get into in the research later.
It's interesting why perfectionism feels like a virtue. The culture, especially, in the Western world, rewards it. When you say I'm a perfectionist, that gets a nods in interviews, like you said earlier in the intro, and it signals that you care, that you're driven, and that you hold yourself accountable.
I think it's just important to say that it's not a badge of honor. People will use it as like, yeah, I'm just a perfectionist. That's not a good thing. But like you mentioned, our achievement culture, our worth in more and more in modern society, our worth is measured by our output. In our kids, it's by their grades or their accomplishments in sports. It's by the job titles, our income, the number of followers we have, or the likes that we get on a social media post, our body composition. It's really about the more we produce and the more polished we are, the more value that we have as a person. And
then there's, how it relates to hustle culture in general. And hustle culture really can amplify this, where, rest is laziness. Even just working 9 to 5 in some industries is seen as lazy, right? Like I think we both grew in our careers in the tech industry, Dave, and I saw that a lot myself, working in sales, revenue marketing teams, where if you're not working after hours, basically, then you're lazy. And that's dangerous too, because then you're getting into just perfectionism of hustling, and you're kind of disregarding the output itself and like the results. You're just grinding and hustling without even thinking about it. So if you're not like pushing, then someone else is passing you. And that can be a dangerous mindset to narrow in on.
Social media is probably the biggest driver of this. Social media is a perfectionism machine. We have curated highlight reels that created this endless comparison loop between us and other people. The obvious unrealistic view of other people's lives. Everyone else looks more together than we feel our own life is, but they are probably thinking the same thing about us if we're present on social media.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's important to realize that most things you see on social media are the perfect pieces of people's lives edited, right? Like not many people are posting the raw, unfiltered versions of their life. So it's easy to get caught in that comparison perfectionism machine.
And that's what makes it hard to address. People don't want to let go of it because they believe it is what is driving their success. But the research says the opposite. And here's another thing. Perfectionism isn't just harmful to us, but it's harmful to all of the people that live with us or around us. It's harmful in our relationships.
Let's dive into the research. And in preparing for this episode, the research was really interesting. There's a lot more research on this, in fact, than I ever imagined. It's a very well researched thing, perfectionism. So the first concept in the research is the different types of perfectionism, which I had no idea about. And researchers Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett spent decades studying perfectionism and identified 3 distinct types. One, self-oriented perfectionism, which is holding yourself to impossibly high standards, right? It's self-oriented. Number 2 is other-oriented perfectionism, holding the people around you to impossibly high standards.
And that's the one where it starts to affect our relationships.
Other people, like you said. Yeah. And then there's socially prescribed perfectionism, is the belief that other people expect perfection from you. So those are the 3, and all 3 cause damage in different ways. But that third one, socially prescribed perfectionism, is the most strongly linked to clinical outcomes, anxiety disorders, depression, burnout, and in the most serious research, and nothing to take lightly, is suicide risk. And the reason that self-oriented perfectionism is at least, in your control, you set the standard, whereas socially prescribed perfectionism is an endless moving target because you're trying to meet a standard you've imagined other people have for you, and that standard has no ceiling because you invented it.
That's interesting. I think we've all interacted with people like that, and you can tell when they feel like they're letting you down or whatever, when they aren't necessarily.
And most people who call themselves perfectionists think they are the first type, the self-oriented type, the driven, high standards person. But when you ask deep down, like what actually drives the voice, it's almost always some version of what will people think. And that's the socially prescribed version of perfectionism. That is the one doing the most damage.
Yeah, that's cool. That the 3 types, and understanding that it's the external one that's the most harmful. And I think we'll get into this later, but being able to identify that in ourselves, which one is it? So here's another concept that we found in the research. In 2019, researchers Thomas Curran and Andrew Hill, they published a meta-analysis in Psychological Bulletin that looked at perfectionism scores across 41,000 college students from 1989 to 2016. So that's a 27-year span, more than a generation's worth. And it's interesting what they found. All 3 types of perfectionism have risen significantly across that time period. But socially prescribed perfectionism had risen by far the most. And the researchers link this rise directly to 3 things. First, it's probably no surprise, the increase in social comparison driven by social media. The second is hyper-competitive academic and professional environments. And we see that in the job market. We see that in the pressure and the standards we're holding our schools to. And the third one is really a cultural shift toward measuring self-worth through achievement and external validation. And so those were the three drivers of seeing perfectionism rise in over more than a generation of time. And what that means practically is if you feel more pressure to be perfect than your parents did at your age, you're not imagining it. The environment has actually changed. There's been a cultural shift in our society. And the internal voice that comes with that environment has changed alongside it.
Interesting. That's super interesting research. I mean, it makes sense, especially those three things you listed. But the other thing I'm thinking about is just there's so, in 2026 versus call it 20 years ago, or what people call the good old days, there's just so much more noise, right? So it's even more important today, more than ever, to have that self-awareness and know what's truly driving you. Right? Is it external forces or is it internal? That's interesting. The next concept is around, distinguishing perfectionism versus high standards. And this distinction, matters a lot. And Brene Brown's research on shame and perfectionism found that perfectionism is consistently misunderstood, including by the people who have it. Perfectionism is not the same as striving for excellence. The difference is where the standard is anchored. High standards are anchored to the work. I want to do this well, and if I fall short, I will learn and adjust. Perfectionism is anchored to identity. If this is not perfect, it means I'm not enough, and, I can't survive people seeing that version of me. So Brown describes perfectionism as a 20-pound shield we carry, thinking it will protect us from that pain of blame, judgment, shame. And it does offer some protection, or feels like it, but it also prevents the vulnerability that makes real connection, real creativity, real growth possible. So you cannot produce something meaningful if you're terrified of what people will think of it.
And we'll come back to this later. I'm going to tell my own personal experience of going through this. And I think that what you just mentioned was the primary driver there. Another concept is the performance paradox. And for me, this is interesting because this is sort of counter to what I had expected. Here's what the research on perfection and actual performance shows. What I had thought as we were getting into this topic, I knew that perfectionism was harmful to mental health. I knew that perfectionism was harmful to the relationships with people around us, but I also assumed that perfectionism resulted in higher performance. It just came at a cost, and that the cost wasn't worth it. But this is what's super interesting. Researchers Stober and Otto found what they called adaptive perfectionism. So high personal standards without excessive concern about mistakes actually improves performance. But perfectionism, defined by fear of mistakes and fear of judgment and concern about perfectionism, decreases performance. So just to say it again, I assumed that perfectionism resulted in overall better performance, but came at a personal toll and a toll to the people around us in a way that it wasn't worth it. But the research is the opposite. That perfectionism reduces, and it makes sense the more you think about it. When we're afraid of making mistakes, honestly, when I coached kids and youth in sports, I noticed this a ton. I could tell. As a coach, I was a very positive coach, and I provided correction during practice, but never during a game. I didn't want kids to have a fear of making mistakes during the game. And I noticed the parents that were super engaged in a sort of a almost like critical way and always correcting their kids, those kids were very hesitant. They were afraid of making mistakes. And particularly as you get older, that may change. I'm not an expert coach at elite levels or in adults. But what I found in children and young youth, that the best thing is to remove that fear of mistakes. And the kids that could play in a game without a constant looking at the coach or looking at their parent afraid they're going to make a mistake, they were better. But the kids that were super hesitant, not hesitant just because they're, hesitant for the pure reason of, I'm afraid to make a mistake because either my coach or my parents or someone who's watching is going to judge me. Those kids didn't grow as much because they were thinking too much without just playing. So anyway, it's a little bit of a digression, but that was sort of my key learning. And I hadn't even framed it in the terms of perfectionism. And I just try to tell the parents, like, game time is the wrong time to correct. Do that a different time. Game time is all about having them feel confident. That's when they're performing. In practice is when you can correct. Anyway, so the perfectionist voice tells you that, like, you're holding yourself to a high standard and that'll produce better work. But it just raises the threat level associated with the work. So if you're afraid of making mistakes, then that threat level rises, and the amygdala, the emotional part of our brain, fires, and the prefrontal cortex, or the logical part of our brain, loses access, and the quality of our work and our decision making goes down, not up. So the voice that says it has to be perfect is not your quality control department. It's your threat detection system. And threat detection mode does not produce your best work.
That's interesting. That's an interesting example you share in sports and youth and such, because I'd imagine the same parents are aware of what a growth mindset is, for instance. If your kid or if anyone is afraid of a misstep, of a mistake, because it's tied to your identity, like that's the opposite of a growth mindset, right? A growth mindset, those missteps and mistakes are part of the process. You know you're going to fail, but you're going to do better tomorrow and learn from it, right? But that just gets in the way of having them evolve and grow. And then the last concept here from the research, which we've talked about indirectly, is the mental health cost. And this is worth naming because most people, as we talked about, treat perfectionism as a quirk rather than a risk. But the clinical research from Hewitt Flett and their colleagues show that the chronic perfectionism is truly a significant predictor of anxiety disorders, clinical depression, burnout, even disordered eating, and like we've talked about, even cases of elevated suicide risks. So this is not a personality quirk. It really is a threat to long-term mental health and being mentally fit. The mechanism is the same in all cases. The perfectionist standard is impossible to meet. The failure to meet it confirms the fear that you are not enough, your identity. The confirmation deepens the fear. So the deeper fear raises the standard higher, and that cycle continues until eventually something's going to break.
That just got me thinking about our recent episode with Dr. Judd Brewer when we talked about unwinding anxiety, and that one of anxiety he talks about and teaches is really a habit of thought, that we've got into this habit where we worry about something, and then we also do something about it. It gets better, and we falsely associate the worry as part of what made things get better. And so we think that when we're worrying, we're actually working. And so we think we're actually accomplishing something. And I was just thinking, as you were sharing that last point, and thinking about perfectionists that I know, and many of them are very high achieving individuals. And so they might recognize that this perfectionist standard they hold themselves to does come at a cost to their mental health, but they falsely associate it as part of the reason of why they're successful or good at what they do. And so they, wanting to be successful, determine that it might be worth the cost. Right?
No, that's a good insight, because he talks about the anxiety loop, how it's cyclical like that. But what you're highlighting here is the perfectionist loop, right? Where when you're not meeting the standard means you're not enough, and that confirmation deepens the fear. Then you raise your standards higher, and that loop just continues.
But the last 2 points, the performance paradox, which is basically, I think, that false idea that that perfectionism actually does drive better outcomes and performance, combined with the cost of mental health, when we can link those two together and realize you're not your best self when you're holding yourself to a perfectionist standard, you're actually hurting your performance, and that you may have other good qualities. You might be driven and have high standards also alongside perfectionism, and you think that that you have to have both, right? But there is, and we're going to get into ways to address and overcome perfectionism later in the episode. But that's the important point, is recognizing it doesn't have to be both. High performance doesn't have to come at the mental health cost.
Right.
So let's talk about the perfectionism paradox in real life. Perfectionism supposedly drives better output. In practice, it produces the project that never gets started because it would not be good enough. So we think it's helping us, but it really is holding us back, the hesitations we have. It prevents us from sending the email that just sits in draft for 3 days because we want it to be perfect, or the creative work that gets abandoned before anyone sees it out of fear that someone will see a mistake in it. The conversation that never happens because it might not go perfectly.
That's interesting. This is when if you listen to our episode on procrastination, look how much crossover there is. Because what you just stated is essentially procrastination, right? Like, the planning phase feels safe. Nothing can be judged in the planning phase, and perfectionists love the planning phase because it's not a vulnerable state, right? So there's a lot of crossover with procrastination.
And we highlighted that in the procrastination episode, that there is some overlap here. And it's interesting that that's what happens. It's the fear of being seen as inadequate because of that perfectionist standard that stops or prevents us from getting started or from finishing something. And the longer a task sits undone, then the more emotionally loaded it becomes. So the perfectionist doesn't procrastinate because they don't care. They're procrastinating because they care too much. And that sounds weird, right? I'm procrastinating doing something because I care too much. But that is one of the main reasons that people procrastinate, is because they fear delivering something imperfect. It'd be better to not deliver something, or to deliver something and be able to say, oh yeah, I just pulled an all-nighter to get this done. That's why it's not perfect.
This one I hadn't thought about too much, Dave, but it's the other-oriented perfectionism relationships you talked about earlier. Holding people around you to impossible standards, like the partner who can never get it right, the kid who never hears that they did well, which you kind of gave an insight to that earlier around sports and such, or the team member whose work is always just short. This type of perfectionism is one of the most damaging relational forces around your true connection to others.
And I think in parents, if you suffer from perfectionism yourself, for many parents, they feel that their children and their children's performance and achievement and attainment is a reflection or an extension of themselves. So that's an incorrect idea as a parent. But if we have that idea coupled with perfectionist tendencies in ourselves, that's a bad combo as a parent, because now we're holding our children to a standard and can easily become hypercritical of them when they're not doing the things or accomplishing or obtaining the things that we think they should, to highlight that we're a good parent or that we're a good family, or the things that we want for them. But, when children are young, they want nothing more than to please their parents. And when they sense that it's never good enough, it's very confusing and difficult for them, because they're trying to figure it out. And in some cases, they just give up, totally rebel against. Or in other cases, they keep trying, develop perfectionist tendencies themselves, and at a toll to their own mental health. They develop mental illnesses and anxieties and other things because they're just constantly trying to figure out how to be of worth to the people that they love the most, and they can't figure it out.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure there's people out there, parents out there that can point at this given time and say, well, I'm applying these standards and this perfectionism to my child. Look, they're doing just fine. But like we talked about the perfectionism loop that you highlighted, eventually over time, it will break. Is cognitively and emotionally expensive. So it might not be in that moment, but 10 years down the road for that kid, or 5 years, who knows when it is, perfectionism burnout is real. It's documented. There's plenty of research on it, and I don't think it's talked about enough.
Yeah, and this is not the same as having high standards for our children or our partner or those around us. I love when people raise me, either a boss or a coworker or a friend or a family member or a parent, when they raise my sights for myself because they expect more of me or they have high standards. So that's not, having high expectations of others is a good thing, but perfectionism is not high standards, like we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's not a high standards thing, like we talked about. The distinguishing thing, or this distinction there, is if, in this case, we're talking about like a child, if they're tying it to their identity, if them being a failure means they're less of a person. Whereas to your point, it's like, hey, Dave, you didn't do great. I know you're capable of so much more. You're an amazing human being. Let's do a little better next time. Right? And just as long as it's not tied to the identity, the high standards should be there, in fact. So let's walk through a few examples of, real world application where you might either see this in yourself or just some common scenarios where, perfectionism happens. One is just in creative work or just starting tasks or doing things, when you have a blank page in front of you, or the first draft of your book that never gets written, the business idea that you've wanted to do, but it's always just stays as an idea. You're not ready yet. And perfectionism is the loudest before that first step, the first action. And that's exactly when it needs to be the quietest. So the reframe there is the first version of whatever your only job is simply to exist. It's to start, not to be good, not to be ready, just to exist. So lower the bar for starting. You can always raise it later if needed, but imperfect and done will always beat perfect and never started.
Oh, I love that. And then there's a sort of high stakes performance. That can be presentations, pitches, interviews, competitions, performance, like musical performances or athletic competitions outside the work environment or the school environment. The perfectionist voice is loudest here because the stakes of judgment are the highest. I mean, you're literally being judged on what you do. And what the voice is doing at that moment is it's raising the threat level right before you need to perform. And so this is really the performance paradox playing out in real time. And as the fear of failure consumes our mind, then our ability to perform is going to go down. So the reframe is preparation is what you can control. The outcome is not. And the shifting that internal standard from this has to go perfectly to I've prepared well and I can handle whatever comes. And I'm just going to share a real brief personal experience with one of my sons. I have a son that is an elite swimmer, very competitively, swims very competitively, high school club, college level. And there was a time when he was, 17, 18, and I could just see really a perfectionist standard in himself. And if he didn't get his best times or improve or reach his goal in every single meet. He was really hard on himself. And I kind of started to sense that some of it was obviously self-inflicted, and some of it might have been that third one we talked about that was external. He may have felt that that's what we expected. I was always trying to help him accomplish his goals and started to wonder if my engagement in his meets and everything was being interpreted by him as my holding a standard to him. So I had a talk with him one day, and I pulled up John Wooden, who's known to be one of probably the greatest college basketball coach of all time. He coached at UCLA, won 10 national championships. He has this quote on success and his definition of success. So I talked to my son. I said, this is how John Wooden defines success. It's the peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to become the best of which you are capable. And that's an interesting thing. And I talked about how John Wooden was asked in an interview who the most successful players he ever coached were. And you might say, if you said, who are the two most successful players that John Wooden ever coached, you'd say Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was known at that time as Lou Alcindor. He changed his name later and he converted to Islam. And Bill Walton. They were NBA All-Stars. They were incredibly successful at the college level. But John Wooden named two players that no one knows because they never played in the NBA. But by his definition of success, they had attained the best that they were capable of more than any two other players he had ever coached. And I said to my son, I said, you are so dedicated. You are so diligent in your practice and in other areas of your life, your sleep and your nutrition and everything, to be the best you can be. And I said, you are the most successful athlete I know. And I was like, I don't care how you perform. All you can control is how well you prepare. And in that conversation, I could almost sense this like weight falling off his shoulders. And I think that just really made him feel good. And you know what's interesting? His next meet, just a couple weeks later, he had breakthrough times. He had personal bests in every event. And I attribute it to just him internalizing this pressure was gone. The fear of failure was gone. And it was the perfectionist paradox, like, in a way, overcoming that. And he had breakthrough times. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, even just in you telling that story right here and now, I can imagine the weight off the shoulders, right? So that's super cool. That makes sense. It's relevant to this next part where one of the most dangerous moments for perfectionism, it is when you fail or make a mistake. A normal setback becomes evidence that fundamentally you're inadequate, right? I failed at that becomes I'm a failure. That's the collapse of the work, forming into your identity. So the redirect and reframe there is that, yes, that didn't go the way I wanted, but just taking that as data. What does this setback tell me? It's a process, not a verdict. It shouldn't be forming your identity. So self-compassion after failure is not weakness. The research shows it's the single strongest predictor actually of getting back up and trying again. So the key here, and this really simplifies it for me, is just disconnecting the who, the identity, from the output, the result.
Yeah, I love what you said there. Self-compassion is not weakness. And that the research shows that that's a strong predictor of people getting back up and trying again. And I think you just see a lot of really successful people, they have to be practicing self-compassion, especially people, either it's elite athletes or elite business leaders or whatever, when they're in these high-stake environments. There's no other way they can sustain it that long. We talked about relationships already, but just touch on it a little bit again. The other-oriented perfectionism is one of the most corrosive forces in close relationships. This is impossible standards just produce resentment. They lead to withdrawal and people stop trying. I've already talked about the perfectionist parent, but the perfectionist parent, the child who hears correction more than affirmation, the long-term cost of that is measurable in adult self-esteem and shame research. It affects their them, and it will affect the parent-child relationship into adulthood. And the perfectionist leader, the team that stops taking creative risks because nothing is ever quite right. So it's worth naming because many listeners won't identify, as self-oriented perfectionists, but they will recognize this pattern when they hear it. It's really important just to take an inventory of if our own perfectionist tendencies might be taking a toll on those we love the most.
Everything we talk about on this show, the science, the frameworks, the habits, New is where you actually put it into practice. New is the mental fitness app built to help you reflect, notice patterns, and build real mental strength and capacity over time. It remembers what you're working on and meets you where you are. Not therapy, not toxic positivity, just a daily practice for your mental fitness. If you're watching this, scan the QR code on screen. If you're listening, head to talkwithnew.com. That's talkwithnue.com. Let's jump into something practical. And what we've boiled it down to is 5 tools for unhooking the worth or the identity piece from the output or the results. So let's walk through those. The first is, we've talked about this on many episodes around your connection to self, is just notice. Perfectionism lives inside the thought. The moment you can watch and notice the thought instead of being it, something shifts. And that's all the science around the amygdala we've talked about so many times. So instead of this is not good enough, you say, I notice I'm having the thought that this is not good enough. Just being aware of it. Same thought, but you have a different relationship to the thought. So this is that, foundational awareness mindfulness move. It's not a therapy technique. It's not a framework. It's just awareness, the ability to observe what your mind is doing instead of getting pulled along by it and just reacting, right? You're responding instead. So you do not have to believe everything your mind tells you, but noticing creates that gap between the thought and your response to it. That gap is where the choice lives.
And then the second tool is self-compassion. We talked about this earlier a bit, and we've talked about it in other episodes. Kristen Neff is sort of the world's leading researcher on self-compassion. And here's a really important point to internalize and understand. Self-compassion is not lowering your standards. This is the most common misconception. Neff's research shows that self-compassionate people hold equally high standards, but they recover faster from setbacks. They end up, in the long run, taking on harder goals, and they're less paralyzed by fear of failure. So the practice is you treat yourself after a mistake the way you would treat a close friend after the same mistake. That specific exercise is in the research, and it produces a measurable shift. So the way we talk to ourselves, just being kind to ourselves. The question to ask is, what would I say to someone I love who just went through this? What words of encouragement might I say or offer? Then say those to yourself. That might seem a little cheesy, and this is all just like kumbaya, just love yourself. But the research is clear. Self-compassionate people take on more, have harder goals, have high standards. They recover faster from setbacks.
The next tool number 3 here, it's called process goals over outcome goals. You can, another way to put this simply is control what you can, right? Control what you can't control and not the outcome. You see this a lot in sports psychology at elite levels, where they shift the measure of success from what happens, the outcome, to what you do, the process. So an outcome goal is, let's say, for example, give a perfect presentation. The process goal is prepare thoroughly, make eye contact, speak clearly, handle the questions that come to you calmly. So process goals are fully within your control. Outcome goals, or the result, are not in your control at all. So perfectionism lives in the gap between what you can control and what you cannot. But every time you meet a process goal, you have evidence of success regardless of the external outcome. And that evidence is what builds durable confidence rather than conditional confidence.
That's super interesting. In the gap between what you can control and what you cannot control is where perfectionism lives. Tool 4 is redefining the standard. So perfectionism really operates on a moving, undefined goalpost. It's never quite right because right or perfect is never really specified. So the practice is, before starting any significant task, name specifically what good enough looks like. Not perfect, but good enough. This really reminds me of the quote by Winston Churchill that perfection is the enemy of progress. And, if we're going to hesitate to start because of perfection, we're just not going to make progress. So we're really defining what good enough is. Good enough for this email is clear, accurate, and sent today. Or good enough for this presentation is that the key message lands and I've prepared for the likely questions. A specific standard can actually be met, but a perfect standard can never be met. So naming it takes the power out of the moving goalpost.
The last tool is simply exposure practice. And this is a behavioral tool where you're deliberately finishing and releasing things that might be just good enough, not perfect. So the perfectionist has years of evidence in their mind that releasing imperfect work leads to disaster. And the only way to update that evidence is to release imperfect work, or what you think is imperfect work, and observe that you survived it. You did the task. Maybe it wasn't to the standards of, how you think about things as a perfectionist, but hey, you're okay. You survived it. You survived. And start small, right? Send the email that is not perfectly worded. Post the thing you would normally sit on for another day. Submit the first draft. And each time you release something imperfect and nothing catastrophic happens, you build new evidence. Over time, the threat level associated with that imperfect output goes down. So it's about just exposing yourself to imperfection, or what you might think is imperfection, realizing you can survive. And I think what's interesting about the exposure practice is it's the only tool on this list that works beneath the level of thinking. The other 4 are cognitive. They change how you relate to the thought. This one bypasses the thought entirely, and it updates the pattern at the level that the brain actually learns. Because as we talked about this with Judd Brewer on the previous episodes, the brain does not update through understanding or intellectually understanding something alone. It updates through direct experience. So you have to expose yourself. You have to go take action because, and I love this quote from Dr. Brewer, the feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain. You cannot think your way out of perfectionism. At some point, you have to do something imperfect and let the experience be the teacher.
Just thinking of everything we've talked about, and I kind of hinted at this at the beginning, but I want to just tell a story that I went through early in my life with perfectionism that nearly destroyed me. And I'm the youngest of 6 kids. I grew up in a wonderful home, happy childhood. Did not have perfectionist parents who, had they had high standards for all of us, but that not from a perfectionist standpoint. I felt loved and supported. But sort of internally, I was just very driven as a young kid. Got really involved in scouts. I became one of the youngest Eagle Scouts ever. A month after my 12th birthday, right at the beginning of my 13th year, I earned my Eagle Scout award, and I earned all these merit badges, and I got into junior high and I was a 4.0 student and got straight A's and was in the, all these like advanced classes. And I just had really high standards for myself. I went to high school and I set a goal the beginning of my freshman year of high school that I was going to be the valedictorian of my class. And I worked really hard in school. And my first semester of freshman year, I got straight A's, except for one class. I got an A minus. And when I got that A minus, I was just like, I couldn't believe it. And I felt like the goal is no longer obtainable because perfection, I had to be perfect. And I was no longer perfect in my grades in high school. And I did a complete 180. I stopped caring altogether about school. So much so that I nearly failed out of high school. I failed many classes and took summer school and night school my senior year to eventually graduate. Barely graduated with very low grades. And then, made it past, went to college and kind of did a reset and said, I'm going to do 4.0 in college. And went my first semester of college, took really hard classes, got a 4.0 and was sort of, in a way, back on track. The crazy thing is it took me years to recognize what happened. I went so extreme. It was everything we've talked about, and I didn't even fully understand it for many years. But it was so much tied, perfectionism was so much tied to my identity that if I couldn't be perfect with that 1A minus, then I couldn't act like I cared. So I became the anti-student. I made fun of my friends that were good students. And one of my closest friends actually was our class valedictorian. And we're still very close to this day, but I always made fun of him in high school because he was missing out on all these fun opportunities while he was in school. But secretly, I was just jealous. I was jealous of my friends that were doing well in school. But I couldn't try because I had this such strong perfectionist tendency to protect myself from how that would affect my identity. It was easier to pretend like I didn't care at all than to try and fall short of my goal. And I think back how much I missed out on in terms of academic growth and other opportunities. And fortunately, I was kind of able to figure this out. It was really like my early mid-20s when I kind of got to a point where I stopped caring so much about perfectionism and was able to really love myself and not have my identity tied to my outcome. Fortunately, I learned it at a relatively young age.
Saying you learned it at a relatively young age, was there a moment when you kind of named it in a shifting? Was it gradual, or when you did become aware of this for what it actually was, like what shifted?
It was probably a lot of things. It wasn't one moment, but I do think going to college and being able to get straight A's my first semester, I kind of like proved back to myself, okay, I'm a capable person if I apply myself. And then just realizing also how hard college was, compared to some of my friends who actually studied in high school and developed the study habits and skills that I was now trying to relearn as a freshman in college. And I just started to kind of slowly realize through the years of college that I really shot myself in the foot and how dumb that was. And then got really down on myself over that. And then just sort of eventually, I don't know if it was one moment, but just sort of figuring out. And it was really when I was newly married and talking about it with my wife, who very ironically was the valedictorian of her high school. She was very good. She was the opposite of me in high school in terms of like very responsible on top of things. But in conversations when the first couple of years we were married is when I really sort of recognized I did this to myself and it was totally stupid. And then being able to like apply that to my current life and saying like, God, why am I so hard on myself? And it didn't change. I still try to be accomplished in my career and in my personal life and everything, but I just don't get down on myself. I think I've really learned to practice self-compassion. I do my best. And then if I fall short, I'm like, oh, no worries.
Yeah, you've detached the result from your identity, right?
Yeah, that was the big one. My identity wasn't it's not tied to what happens in my career or my GPA or anything else. My identity is totally independent of my performance.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, Dave. I can't think of a better personal story there to highlight this topic. And I appreciate your high standards. They are very high. And, but you do practice, self-compassion. I've seen that. So let's take a second just to recap, some core key ideas from this episode as we wrap up here. And I think we've said this a few times, but I think it is important to understand that we're not saying perfectionism is not a high standard. It is a fear response. It's the voice that's protecting you from judgment, not pushing you towards excellence.
And there's 3 types. Socially prescribed is the most damaging and is the most common driver underneath what people think is self-oriented perfectionism.
And you can see it, perfectionism, and the data shows it's rising across generations. And if the pressure feels higher than it used to be, it is higher.
Yeah, and then there's the performance paradox, which we talked a lot about. That's the voice that demands perfection actually produces worse outcomes, despite what you might think. That threat mode does not create your best work.
And we talked about the importance of the mental health cost here. It's real and documented. That emotional and mental health burden is a serious result of perfectionism.
Yeah. So the 5 tools: diffusion, self-compassion, exposure practice, redefining the standard, and process goals.
The work is not you, remember. The output is not the measure of the person producing it. Separating those 2 things is the whole practice here.
Yes, I think core takeaway, perfectionism is not the thing making you better. It's the thing making starting harder, finishing harder, and recovering from failure harder. So you don't need to lower your standards. You need to unhook your worth from your output. And those are not the same thing.
So one challenge after you listen to this episode, identify one thing you've been holding back because it is not ready yet. One thing still sitting in draft and planning in your head, and ask, what is the minimum version of this that would be good enough to exist? Not great, not perfect, just exist. And do that version this week. Release it. Observe what happens. It's not going to be catastrophic. You're going to survive. And the evidence you build from that one act is worth more than anything you can think your way to. If this episode hit home for you, please do us a favor and leave a rating or review wherever you're listening. It takes about 30 seconds, and it's genuinely the most powerful way to help this show reach people who need it. Share it with someone who could use it, leave a rating, and we'll see you next week.